class we fell a little short of what I did in the earlier class. We didn't quite get to all the transfiguration stuff on Tuesday. And so we talked through the parables and a lot of the early ministry stuff of Jesus over the last couple of days before. And we stopped off right here, and the transfiguration is honestly, it's a weird moment. And for a long time, I had no idea what they could do with it, honestly. Here's what happens. Here's the basic nuts and bolts. After a period of probably at least two and a half years of public ministry with his 12 disciples, Jesus asks, as they have traveled up to Caesarea Philippi, they're out of their usual surroundings, Jesus asks his disciples, well, who do people say that I am? What are the people saying about me? And they started listing off things that they had heard from people. That some said that he was a great prophet. Some said that he is, Elijah returned, or that he is John the Baptist come back to life. But most of the people had these, good things to say about him. But then he looks at his disciples and he says, well, who do you say that I am? What's your opinion? What do you think? And Simon Peter answers, or Simon at this point answers back and says, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah of God, you're the one that God has sent. And one of the Gospels records as saying, you are the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the Most High God. And it's at this point that Jesus gives Simon the nickname Peter. He says, you are Peter, and on this Petros, this rock, I will build my church. And so that's the origin of the nickname Peter. So Peter says this thing that is correctly identifying Jesus after traveling with him and being with him for so long. And he says it's on this that my church will be built. And so he's like, you are Peter, you are you are Peter, and on this Petros I will build my church. So Peter has correctly named and titled Jesus, but then Jesus stops and says, now what this means is that I'm going to be rejected, and I'm going to be persecuted, be rejected by the people, and ultimately killed, but on the third day rise again. That for me to be the Messiah, that's what this means. This is where this is going. I am going to die and then rise again. And Peter, when he hears that, having just proclaimed the Messiah, rejects that idea, because that's not what the Messiah is supposed to do in his mind. And so he rebukes Jesus, takes him aside and rebukes him, and then Jesus rebukes him right back and says, get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the things of God, the things of people. You have the human concerns in mind. Yeah, it is a very intense reaction. And if you take the assumption that Jesus is, anything like what Christians say, if you assume that he is something like what he says he is, then a really good exercise is to ask, why does he react so strongly to that? Why does he, as the Son of God, the Messiah, react so powerfully to Peter rejecting that idea about him, that he was separated by him? Yeah. Yeah, well, and part of it is there's something hidden in the English translation that the word that's used for Peter's rebuke of Jesus, when Peter goes to rebuke Jesus, it's actually the same term that's used for casting out the demons and a lot of other places. And so Peter's taking Jesus aside and rebuking him is not like a calm conversation. He's going after Jesus pretty hard, and then Jesus responds and says, get behind me, Satan. Feasible. And so there's kind of a parody in the intensity level of the conversation, but it's still surprising that Jesus comes back that strongly. And again, it's a good exercise to ask why. Why does Jesus respond that strongly? But that would be getting way into like a sermon, which I would be normally happy to do, but we're already behind, and that's preaching isn't actually what it's supposed to be there. But so Jesus predicts his death and deals with Peter, and then a few days later, one of the Gospels says about 8 days later, another one says it was 6 days later, another says a few days later. So about 6 to 8 days later, the disciples are with Jesus, and Jesus takes Peter and James and John on top of a high mountain, and while he is there, he is transfigured before them. And this story, or this account, is in these three locations in the Gospels. And each one of the three synoptics describes what happens to Jesus, or the appearance of Jesus being slightly different, but close enough that we can kind of get a picture of what likely happened, or what he might have looked like anyway. Matthew describes him as his face, or his clothes became dazzling white, and his face shone like the sun. And Mark says that his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And then Luke says that his countenance changed and his clothes became as white as a flash of lightning. And became like white and bright like a flash of lightning. So light was not just, it's not just that he became extremely clean looking. He didn't become a phenomenal Clorox commercial, right? He was emanating light. He was shining. And it's described as a bright white light, which is significant in the first century, because where would you get a source of bright white light?
The sun?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like the light from the sun is the whitest light you're going to get, or from a flash of lightning. And if you want to light up at night, if you want to create an artificial light, it's going to be from flame, which is going to be a red, yellow, orange light, somewhere in that spectrum. And they have no movies with special effects. They have no graphics to go by where they have had a lifetime of picturing unnatural events because they've been able to see them on screen, and they've been able to see them depicted on screen. They don't have any of that. And so for them to see Jesus suddenly shining in bright white light would have been extraordinarily weird. It would have been incredibly odd. We would still, if I suddenly started gleaming white and pouring off light, y'all would be weirded out and probably get out of the room fairly quickly, right? It would still be weird. But you've seen enough movies where somebody starts glowing that it's probably not going to strike you quite as deeply as it would have these disciples in the first century that had never seen anything like it. And so Jesus starts glowing white, and then Mark's depiction of it is Peter is so overawed by what he's seeing. He's so terrified by the moment that he starts babbling, and he says, "Teacher, it's good for us to be here. Let's build 3 tabernacles, 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah, and let's just stay." Oh, I forgot to mention, Moses and Elijah appear and start talking to Jesus. And so these 2 ancient figures, these 2 figures from the Old Testament that are legendary in Jewish mindset in the first century, start talking to Jesus. They appear and they start talking with Jesus. And then Peter, terrified out of his wits at the glowing white Jesus, and Moses and Elijah there talking to Jesus, and suddenly starts babbling and says, "Let's build 3 tents, 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and let's just stay." And then as they're saying that, as he's just finished saying that, suddenly a bright cloud descends on the mountaintop, and out of the cloud a voice speaks and says something very similar to what was said at the baptism. In fact, one gospel has it be exactly the same as the baptism with an extra phrase at the end, and the other 2 have a slightly different phrasing. So 2 of the gospels say, "This is my son, whom I love, listen to him." And the third one says, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased, listen to him." And the one that says, "With whom I am well pleased," that's exactly what was said at the baptism, and then he adds, "listen to him." The other 2 just record the first half with the "listen to him." And so it's the voice speaks from heaven saying something very similar to what was said at the baptism with the addition of "listen to him." And then they hear that, and after a moment, suddenly everything ends. Moses and Elijah are gone. One of the Gospels has them falling down in fear, and then when they look back up, everything is over. Another Gospel just describes the scene that it just ended. The vision or whatever was happening ended. And Jesus is back there talking to them, back there with them just as himself. Moses and Elijah are gone, and the glowing is gone. And then they go back down, and they find this father and his young son who is being plagued by a demon, and Jesus heals him when the other disciples couldn't. And so that's the basic nuts and bolts of the story of the Transfiguration. But it is kind of a weird story, right? So why does Jesus all of a sudden in the middle, out of nowhere, there's nothing really predicting this in the story up to this point. Why is he suddenly glowing like an electric light bulb and talking with Old Testament figures? Like that. Anything else in the story pointing to that, looking towards that? It's just all of a sudden this happens. So what's going on? Well, there's a couple of connections that you need to get in order to kind of sort of at least maybe see what's going on, what symbolically is meant or is intended by this picture. One is if you look back to Exodus, chapter 19 is where it starts. The 19FF there is a shorthand way of saying 19 and following, so you can put an F or an FF at the end of something to indicate that you're supposed to continue reading after that point. And for Exodus, you have to get this whole story, you have to start reading in Exodus 19 and keep reading through about Exodus 32 or 33 to get all what I'm telling you. So it's a long chunk, but that's the reference. So in this story in Exodus, the people have just been led out of the wilderness, or they've been led out of captivity in Egypt. They come through the desert of Sinai. After coming through the Red Sea, they come through the desert of Sinai, and they come to Mount Sinai, and God tells them to come to the mountain, and then he gives instructions about what they're doing when they're there. And he tells them, don't come on the mountain at all, don't touch the mountain. If even one of your animals comes on the mountain, it must be stoned to death, because no one can approach God in God's presence in all his holiness and survive it, unless they are prepared, unless God calls them and they are prepared. And so God gives them these instructions, and they set boundaries around the mountain, and nobody comes past that boundary unless God calls. And so then God calls Moses and has him go up the mountain, and on the mountaintop, God gives Moses the tablets of the law. He gives them the 10 Commandments, he gives Moses the 10 Commandments, and then all of the instructions for how they are to build the tabernacle and to go about tabernacle worship, how they're to make their sacrifices, do all those things.
Why do you believe by some people, especially like modern Jews, that the tablets were on sapphire? Is that whole anyway?
I never heard of the sapphire, but not in particular. The text just says tablets of stone. I mean, if you're real interested, I could look it up in Hebrew and see if there's some connection between the term used for stone there and the term used for sapphire in other places in the Old Testament. I've never heard that one, but it had to be sapphire too.
Blue, I've heard it was like more common in like modern day Jews that they consider them sapphire. I was like, I've never received them sapphire.
I don't know. I have heard, and I took Hebrew just a couple years ago to try to finish rounding up what I do, and one of the things that I learned in doing that is that the two tablets were probably not like, it was two copies, most likely. And it was two copies of the law, one to be displayed and one to be included in the Ark of the Covenant. And they were written on front and back, and it wasn't just the 10 Commandments that was on it, it was the entire set of commandments for the 10 Commandments, the law, and all the tabernacle furnishings and all the procedures in the tabernacle. But the sapphire thing was new to me. I have to go look that up and see. I never heard of it. So at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up on top of the mountain at God's invitation and receives these two tablets, the commandments from God, the tablets of the law, and he comes back down and he finds that the people have already messed up and broken the first of the 10 Commandments. They have built a golden calf, and are worshiping it. And so in his anger at the people for betraying already, for committing idolatry already, he smashes the tablets and goes on a kind of a vengeance spree. And he and a bunch of other the more faithful Israelites end up killing off a bunch of everybody that had been worshiping the idol, and then he burns the idol, mixes it in with their food and drink for a while. And then he goes back up the mountain. God calls him back up the mountain and repeats. Basically, Moses has to then go and carve two stone tablets and bring them up the mountain, and then God recarves them, gives them back to him as the tablets of the law. And while he's there, he asks to see God's glory. And God gives him a glimpse of the trailing edge as he's fading away. He says, you cannot see my face and live. But he allows him to see something of God's glory. And when Moses comes back down the mountain, his face is shining. His face is glowing. And it is so unnerving to the people of Israel when they see his face glowing that they ask him to wear a veil. And he has to go around wearing a veil until the glow fades. So the glow goes away. And that becomes this kind of symbol for the people. Anytime Moses goes into the tent of meeting and God speaks to him and gives him instructions there, his face will glow, and he will come out and tell them what God said while his face is glowing, and it assures them that he really is speaking from God, because he's been heard from God. And then he has to wear a veil for a while after that to let the glow fade so that people aren't weirded out by it. And so that's a lot of what is happening in Mount Mount Sinai is being echoed in this transfiguration. Jesus is glowing, but it's not the kind of gentle glow that Moses is apparently dealing with. It's like you cannot look at him. It's bright as a flash of lightning. It's difficult. His face shines like the sun. It's difficult to look at. And he is also speaking to Moses and Elijah on top of the mountain. But then there is this dark cloud, or there is a bright cloud. There is a cloud that settles down over the top of the mountain, and God speaks out of that cloud, just like he did on Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, the presence of God descended as a cloud on the mountain, and then God spoke to Moses on the mountain. And so there's a lot of this that is echoing what happened at Mount Sinai, but then the question you have to ask is, why can his disciples be there? Because at Mount Sinai, Moses alone could go up on the mountain because no one else could enter the presence of God. No one else could enter the presence of the Holy God and live. And so why can the disciples be here now? And why is he glowing like a flash of lightning or like the sun, like a source of light, instead of just reflecting it, instead of being a reflection? Because that's kind of the indication or kind of the implication of the intense brightness of his face, the intense brightness of the light that he gives off. Is that he is not just reflecting the light, but he is the source of it. He is an emanating point of the light. So why is he there emanating the glory of God? And why can his disciples be there without being destroyed? And then why Moses and Elijah and not some other figures? With Moses and Elijah, we can probably give you a pretty good answer. One is because both Moses and Elijah had interactions with God on the mountaintop, and there's some indication that maybe it was actually with Jesus. And Jesus is crossing time and space to have this conversation with them, maybe. That's a little bit of a speculative idea. But symbolically, it's important that it's Moses and Elijah because Moses and Elijah represent the entirety of the Old Testament. Because the entirety of the Old Testament can be summarized in the phrase, Moses and the prophets. And Elijah is seen as the perfect emblematic prophet. He is the ultimate prophet. And so you have Moses and the prophets. And so you have the entire wisdom of the Old Testament in conversation with Jesus, who is the Word of God, according to John 1. And according to Hebrews, it's in these latter days that God has chosen to speak to us through his Son. In the past, God has spoken in many ways through the prophets and others, and in these last days, God has spoken to us through his Son. If you look at Hebrews chapter 1, that's the first two verses. And so this image has Jesus being equal to the Word of God from the Old Testament. And so he's speaking of Moses' life is equal to the origin or the sources of the Word of God in the Old Testament. And then he is emanating the glory of God because he claims to be the Son of God. He is God. And the disciples are not destroyed by being in the presence of God because that's part of what he is coming to do. And that's part of his mission, is to become the mediating presence between us and the presence of God so that humans are not destroyed by being in God's presence. And so that's all kind of implied in this image, in this transfiguration. And so it is a weird moment, but it's also a very significant moment because it comes, one, immediately after Peter's proclamation that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. And then Jesus tells him, this is what it means for me to be the Messiah. I have to suffer and die and rise again on the third day. And then he takes them up to the mountaintop and shows them what his glory looks like, at least in part. And so he is this bright being who is mediating God's presence so that they are not destroyed. And he is speaking on God's behalf in an equal way with the scripture of the Old Testament. So that's what you get in the Transfiguration. It is a weird moment and confusing image, but any questions before I move on to what our action material is for today? So this actually makes a pretty good transition point because it's after the Transfiguration that the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders really starts to pick up. It's after the Transfiguration that Jesus, and when he leaves the Mount of Transfiguration, he goes back to Galilee briefly and then is on his way to Jerusalem, on his way to Judea. And Matthew and Mark both have him just kind of going to Judea and going to Jerusalem, and then Holy Week starts, and then he's crucified at the end of Holy Week. Luke has a little bit more in that period, that he travels to Judea, and he goes through Samaria on the way, and he actually ends up being rejected by the Samaritans because they don't like that he's going on to Judea and going on to Jerusalem. They think that he ought to stay in Samaria and reject the Jews because a lot of the Jewish leadership is rejected him, and here we Samaritans, we like you, we want you to stay. But Jesus has his mission to go to Jerusalem, and so they reject him because he doesn't want to stay, and he's going on to Jerusalem. And the disciples get a little carried away with this and say, ask Jesus if they should do like Elisha's, the company of the prophets around Elisha in the Old Testament, and call down fire to destroy the Samaritans. Jesus tells them no. Don't call down fire because they don't like us. And they go on to Jerusalem, they go on to Judea. And then Luke has them leave Judea, leave Jerusalem, go across the Jordan River, and travel on the opposite side of the river in that area for a time, a couple of months or longer possibly, and then come back across the river and come into to Judea and to Jerusalem for the last week, for Holy Week. But whichever story you're looking at, the conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders really starts to escalate in this time, after he has predicted his death at their hands. And then he predicts this 3 times during this period, but after he starts predicting his death by the religious leaders, the conflict between him and the religious leaders really starts to escalate. But it starts actually very early in his ministry. Like very, very early on, he is in conflict with them from time to time. And what I'm hoping, I'm going over this specifically today. I'm going over the conflict with the religious leaders as a chunk, because for some reasons, one, because it takes up a lot of Jesus' teaching and ministry. There are a lot of instances in the New Testament and in the Gospels of Jesus in conflict with the religious leaders. And actually, we're looking at the synoptics, so I'm not even getting into the stories in John, which are even more pointed quite often. John tells even more pointed stories of his conflict with the religious leaders. But that's, we're looking just at the synoptics. And so it takes up a lot of space. It's a lot of his ministry is in conflict with the religious leaders. But then I also want you to come out of it understanding how we get from Jesus teaching, preaching, being very popular, to the crucifixion. Because next week we're going to deal with the arrest and trials and crucifixion. That's going to be Tuesday. So I want you to understand how we got there and why there was so much conflict, why Jesus had problems with the Pharisees and other religious leaders, and why the religious leaders had so much of a problem with Jesus that they ultimately had him killed. They go through the Romans and have crucified. So I want you to come out of this understanding the nuts and bolts, the heart of that conflict, so that you know what's going on next week. So very early on in Jesus' ministry, he had several points of conflict. There were several moments where he would do something on the Sabbath day that would bother them, that would bother the religious leaders, especially the Pharisees. The Pharisees were very attentive to the Sabbath. So I think I said earlier in the semester, when I was introducing who the Pharisees are, they had a belief that if all of Israel would just obey the Sabbath day once perfectly, if all of the people of Israel, spread out wherever they are, if they would just be obedient to God regarding the Sabbath day once, one day, God would send the Messiah and they would be free. God would free his people through the Messiah. But they had to show their faithfulness. They had to show their obedience to God by being obedient for one Sabbath day. And so they were very stringent, very, very preoccupied with what happened on the Sabbath day. And so when a person would show up in the synagogue and would have a withered hand or an abnormal abdominal growth or any of several other problems, there are actually at least 3-4 different instances where Jesus heals on the Sabbath day in the Gospels. And so these people would show up on the Sabbath day in the synagogue and Jesus would heal them. And it got to be like by the time they got into the middle part of Jesus' ministry, when they were actually getting to be more fearful of Jesus, they would actually arrange for someone that needed to be healed to be in the room on the Sabbath day. Just so he would heal them, and then they would have a way to accuse him. They'd have something to say about him. But multiple times, Jesus had somebody in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he healed them. And then that caused the Pharisees and the other religious leaders that were in the room to get up in a twist about it, to get upset because he had done labor, he had worked on the Sabbath day. As though, after the last time when we had all the examples of Jesus doing all the miracles and it causing no effort at all, I'm not sure how they got to it was work for him to do this. But then he would proclaim them healed and they would be healed, and they called that work. He was laboring on the Sabbath day. And so they got upset with him for that. And then on another occasion, he was walking along, he and his disciples were on the way to the synagogue, they were on the way to the weekly gathering to hear the scriptures and hear the teachings, and his disciples were grabbing grain off the stalks as they walked by a field, and then they would rub it between their hands and pop the kernels out, and then they just eat the wheat grains out of the heads of grain as they were walking along. So it's kind of basically like they were rubbing it in their hands and then eating it like popcorn or something. You know? Yeah, and the Pharisees looked at this and said, they're doing farm labor. You can't labor on the Sabbath day. Because the Pharisees had gotten this down to such a very precise formula that they interpreted or they understood the disciples grabbing the grain out of the field. That when they tore the heads off, they were harvesting on the Sabbath. And then when they rubbed the grains between their hands to break the grains out of the heads, then they were threshing. And then as they let the stuff that they weren't going to eat fall to the wayside, they were winnowing, and then they were eating. And so the eating was fine. It was all the farm labor, the harvesting, the threshing, and winnowing that they were doing before that. That was a labor, and you weren't allowed to do that. You can't work on the Sabbath day. You can't do farm labor. It's like, this isn't farm labor. I'm just getting a snack as I walk. It's literally on the way to synagogue, guys.
I feel like looking that hard for someone violating the Sabbath is more than itself.
Yeah, and that was one of Jesus' accusations against them is they heap up heavy burdens without lifting a finger to help them, without helping the people. They lift up a heavy burden for they build up this great big heavy burden with the law, their commandments, on the common people, but then they don't lift a finger to help them. And there's very much that the way that they described and the way that they tried to put everything in a box for the Sabbath day, all of the different provisions they had for making sure that you didn't do anything that was work on the Sabbath day, was actually more work to keep up with than if you had gone and done your job, which is very much not what God intended for the Sabbath day. I mean, it was rest. You were supposed to stop and just rest. Part of the reason, let's go off into the Old Testament stuff. Part of the reason for the Sabbath day, the reason that you stop and rest, is because it's an acknowledgement that the world doesn't depend on you. It will keep going in your absence. And so to stop and rest is an act of faith and trust and dependence on God to keep everything going. And so that's part of why God said stop. But part of it is just we need the rest. Humans are not meant to go continually without a break. We need rest.
Otherwise we die.
Yeah, eventually. Yeah, we do not do well.
There are studies that have shown that if you go with about a day without rest, your body or 3 days of rest.
If you go without sleeping for several days, you can your
body
brain will start
will
doing
shut
weird
down.
things and you will die. Yeah, you can straight up die from insomnia. And there are people that have chronically medical insomnia that they literally cannot sleep for several days at a time. People have died from it.
Yeah.
And it's just they don't sleep. But this is talking about just rest, stopping and taking a break from your labor. We need that rest, and it's not healthy for us not to have it. Unless, of course, you have a religious system that turns taking that rest into so much of a labor, so much of a work to keep up with it, that you don't get anything from it in the first place. So that was a big part of Jesus' problem, as we'll see when we're recounting what Jesus' problems with religious leaders were. That was a big part of it. That they made this code that was so complex and so difficult that it made everything impossible for the common person, but then they didn't do anything to make it easier. They didn't lift a finger to help people carry that burden. And so that was part of it is Jesus, his disciples eating on the Sabbath day, all the healings he was doing on the Sabbath day, and so they were upset with him because he was, in their eyes, he was violating all the Sabbath laws. He was violating Sabbath traditions, and so they were mad at him for that. And then he comes along and he starts claiming authority over things that they believe only belongs to God. So, for example, one of the times that he's in conflict with them over what he does on the Sabbath day, or what his disciples specifically doing on the Sabbath day, he claims to be Lord of the Sabbath. He claims to be the one that has the authority to determine what is Sabbath observance and what is not. To wipe away all of their traditions and all of their rules and say this is okay, this is not okay. So he claims to be Lord of the Sabbath, which they understand to mean he's God. If he's saying he's Lord of the Sabbath, and God instituted the Sabbath, it is one of the 10 commandments. It was given to Moses at Sinai. That's the origin of the commandment. So if anybody claiming to have authority to relieve people or to release people from Sabbath obligations, that has to be God. Nobody else has that authority. And then another occasion, he's healing someone, this time not on Sabbath day. He's in the middle of teaching, and friends bring in this paralyzed man and lay him down before Jesus. At least one of the Gospels records him being lowered through the roof. They tear a hole in the roof and lower it through because the crowd are so pressed around Jesus, they can't get in there any other way. And so they bring the friend to him, And Jesus looks at him, and seeing the faith of his friends and everything, he has compassion on him, and he says, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." Son, your sins are forgiven. And there's people watching, including some Pharisees, teachers of the law, and they hear Jesus say that, and they think to themselves, who is this guy that claims to be able to forgive sins? No one can forgive sins except God alone. And Jesus, knowing what they're thinking, responds to them out loud, even though they only thought it. And he responds to them out loud and says, "Why do you say to yourselves, no one can forgive sins? Why is this fellow blaspheming? No one can forgive sins except God alone." Which is easier to say? Son, your sins are forgiven, or take up your mat and walk. But so that you know, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I say to you, rise up, take your mat, and walk. And the man is healed, he gets up and goes home. And so Jesus claims to have the authority to forgive sins. On that occasion and another occasion, a woman comes and he is eating with a Pharisee. A Pharisee is invited him to dinner. And he is eating with this Pharisee, and after being at the dinner for a while, a woman of questionable reputation comes in, a woman that is known as a sinner, and we don't know exactly what her past or pedigree was. There's a lot of history of the church that just kind of assumed that she was a prostitute, but we're not actually told in the text, just that she was a sinful woman. And so she comes in, and she lets down her hair, and she falls down and she starts weeping. And her tears fall on Jesus' feet, and so she wipes his feet clean and uses her hair to dry his feet off. And the Pharisee looks at this and sees what's happening, and he thinks to himself, he doesn't actually say it out loud, he thinks to himself, if he was really a prophet, if he was really a man of God, he would know what kind of woman is touching him and would reject her. And so Jesus looks at him and calls him by name, Simon the Pharisee, and he looks at him and he says, let me tell you a story. So he gives him a parable. He says, a king has two servants, and one of them owes him a small amount of money, and another owes him an enormous amount of money. One owes him $100, and the other owes him $100,000. And the king, looking at both of them, forgives both of their debt. Which one is likely to love him more? Well, the obvious answer is the one that had the larger debt forgiven, that was forgiven $100,000 over the $100. The guy that was, forgiven $100 will probably say thank you. The guy who is forgiven $100,000 will probably have his life changed, right? And so it's like, which one? The one that had the larger debt forgiven. And so he looks at this woman and looks at Simon. And he says, when I came to your house, Simon, you didn't give me any water to wash my feet or a towel to dry it with, and you didn't give me any oil to anoint my head, or you didn't do anything for me to greet me. And yet this woman, because of all that has been done for her, because of her gratitude, has not stopped kissing my feet since she came in, and has washed them with her tears and is drying them with her hair. She has anointed me, and you did not. You didn't greet me, you didn't provide anything for me, and she has done all of this because of her gratitude for the great debt that she's been forgiven. And so Jesus looks at her and says, daughter, your sins are forgiven. And Simon is upset because Jesus is going to forgive sins. So this happens frequently, that Jesus claims authority for things that make the religious leaders very nervous, like having authority over the Sabbath and the ability to forgive sins. And they don't like him because of his dubious relationships with others, one of which is the woman I was just talking about. That Simon, the Pharisee, looks at him and says, in his mind at least, he's saying, if he was really a prophet or a man of God, he would know what kind of woman was touching him and would not be okay with it. And this because in this time, in the first century, in the Jewish mindset, when you associated with someone in public, or when you went and had a meal with them in their home, when you accepted an invitation to their home, you weren't just going to a social event. It wasn't just a fun time to be had. You were expressing an approval for that person, or indicating that there was an intimacy of relationship between you. And so you would not want to accept a relationship to someone who had a bad reputation or something. You wouldn't want to go to a sinner's house. You wouldn't want to go to a tax collector's house. Because if you went to their house and had a meal with them, you would be expressing some approval for them, or indicating that there was a close relationship between you to the public. Everybody would be seeing this and seeing that you approved of them. And so you had to be very careful about whose invitation you accepted, lest you be associated with them, lumped in with them, and thought of with the same brush of paper. It's painted with the same brush. And so the Pharisees and the other religious leaders did not go into the homes of tax collectors and sinners and did not have meals with them. They would not be associated with them because they didn't want their reputation tarnished. And yet Jesus goes and eats with them willingly. One thing that I don't think I have mentioned or talked about in here is the tax collectors, why they would be so poorly thought of. It's probably not that hard to figure out, actually. Nobody really likes tax collectors. Even now, we don't like the IRS. And if you don't know what I mean, it's probably because you haven't paid enough in taxes yet. And when you get a job where you're supporting the whole family and you're making a full salary or making a living for real, and you got to pay a massive chunk of that into the government every year, and you see that bill at the end of the year, you'll understand why we have some misgivings about the IRS even now. But the IRS was a whole different ballgame. The IRS is a whole different ballgame than what tax collection in the Roman Empire was. Because Rome, as an ever-expanding empire, like they were just constantly at war, constantly trying to capture new territories and add to the empire. As this expanding empire, they had a system for collecting taxes that involved basically every time they added a new province, they added a new group, they would find people that were in that local population and make them tax collectors, basically give them this job. And so they would find people that would be loyal to Rome and loyal to the empire amongst this new people, and they would make them tax collectors. And the tax collectors were given the authority to go in and collect taxes from whomever. They had to collect taxes from everybody, but how exactly they went about that was largely up to them. They could collect more from some, less from others, and they had a whole lot of leeway in how they collected the taxes. Rome basically said, you owe us, tax collector, you owe us X amount of dollars. You owe us this. Go collect it. And there were some rules and some laws for how they did that, but they had a lot of leeway, a lot of wiggle room. And so they could charge, if you had a good relationship with a tax collector, you might get charged a lot less in taxes than the person down the street that had a lot less money, but was on the outs of the tax collector. And so they might end up paying twice as much as you, even though you had twice as much money to pay it with. And so they had the ability to influence who paid more and who paid less, and it was largely based on who they liked and what they thought of them. So if you ever made a tax collector mad, you could expect to pay more taxes. But then also, the way that they made their money was by collecting more than Rome required. And so they were told by Rome, collect this much, and so they would collect this much, and they would keep the excess, they would keep the difference. And so they got to keep at least a part of the excess over the minimum that they collected. And so they made their money by taking more than they had to from others. They made their money by robbing, and they had the protection of the Roman government to do it. And so people really did not like tax collectors in the first century. First, because they were from their own people, but they had turned and supported Rome, and now were using Rome's authority to fleece them and take more money from them than was necessary in order to line their own pockets.
Nickel and dime essentially.
Well, yes, only it was more like 20 and 100 of them. It was taking way more than they had to and lining their own pockets with it. And so they were really, really hated. And so Jesus going to eat with sinners and even calling a tax collector for one of his disciples was really, really on the outs because he had a relationship with all of these different people. And when he's confronted about it once, at least once, he looks at the religious leader that is calling him and tells him basically, I did not come to heal those who are well. Those who are well do not need a doctor. I have come to heal the sick. I have come to heal those that needed healing. And so he associates with sinners and tax collectors because that's part of his mission is to heal those who are broken. So that's, these are all things that kind of start piling up very early on in Jesus' ministry. He starts having these conflicts with religious leaders over these things. And then as he becomes more popular, during the first year or so, these things are happening sporadically. And then in the second year and on, as more and more people recognize him, and he's more and more often having crowds follow him, the religious leaders start to feel more and more threatened by him. So now he's not just saying and doing things that are out there and that they don't like. People are really starting to listen to him, and his viewpoints of the things that he is saying are starting to pressure the religious leaders as he goes into the second and into the third year of his public ministry. And so they start trying to more directly stop him, more directly kind of curtail what he's saying and his influence. And that starts with at least one instance of false accusations made against it, that the Pharisees or some of the religious leaders come along and see what he's doing, and they see him drive out evil spirits from someone, And they accuse him of doing these things, of performing these miracles and driving out these demons by the power of Satan, by the power of the devil, by Beelzebul, which is a reference to a really nasty god in the Old Testament, one of the idols worshipped by one of the kingdoms around Israel. So it's the Baal of Zebul, so Beelzebul, or Beelzebub, as you may have heard it before. And so they accuse him of, by Satan, by Beelzebub, casting out demons. And Jesus first is reaction. Who?
Who's Baphomet? I heard that name.
Baphomet?
Yeah.
Baphomet?
Baphomet.
Have you seen Baphomet or
That
Baphomet?
sounds familiar. I had to
It's
look it up.
nobody pronounces it to me.
Okay.
It's been a long time.
I
Well,
always-
I've just heard those demon names, but I can't remember where they come from in here. I've heard people refer to them.
There are no named demons in the Bible except for Lucifer. You know, that's the only angel or fallen angel given a name. So there's a whole lot of other tradition built up in like Jewish folklore and Jewish traditions from before the New Testament era. There are others that are built up and others that are named. But there's no other named demons in the scriptures other than Lucifer.
So I don't remember where those names came from.
So like Beelzebul is a name, it's a title, but it's Baal, which is one of the most commonly worshipped gods, idols in the community surrounding Israel in the middle period of the Old Testament, up through the early prophets and the fall of the northern kingdom. So that's Baal, and then there was a particular Baal being worshipped, or a particular variety of Baal being worshipped in Zebub. So it's the Baal of Zebub. And so that's where Beelzebub comes from, Baal Zebub. And yeah. That's where that title comes from.
I heard that's where that symbol comes from too.
What they know.
The whole
Maybe.
pentagram comes from that. That's what it's meant.
Well, some of that comes out of Judaism. It's like sometimes it's a 5-point star, and like is that the symbol that's associated with Judaism is usually a 6-point star. But then the 5-point star actually connects back to the Torah, the 5 books of the Old Testament. It's like seeing that as being kind of a totem with influence.
So,
There's the history of that kind of the demonic myth. There's a whole mythos around demons, and it is pretty complex, and the history of it is interesting, but not in the New Testament. It's not in the Scripture, so not actually necessary for Christians to pay that much attention to it. So they're making this false accusation against Jesus. He's casting out demons by Beelzebub. And he looks at them and says, don't be ridiculous. A house divided against itself cannot stand. If I was casting out demons, if I was working for Satan, I would not be casting out demons. Because that's his power base. You know, that's his house. And a house divided against itself cannot stand. And then he goes on, if you've ever heard of the unpardonable sin, the unforgivable sin, this is the moment that Jesus talks about it, when he's responding to this accusation that it's by the power of Satan that he's casting out demons. And he says, basically, any sin that you commit, any blasphemy you utter can be forgiven, except for blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And that is unforgivable in some sense. And so it's kind of, he's warning them, it's like, by attributing the work of God in the life of the Messiah to the work of Satan, you are walking very close to this line. And so that's where the unforgivable sin reference comes in, is in reference to this false accusation. And then when the false accusation falls flat, they start coming with some kind of testing, probing questions. And the goal of these questions is to put him in a position where no matter what he says, it's going to reflect badly on him. So no matter how he responds, it's going to be something they can use against him. So if he says yes, or if he says no, or if he gives any of the most obvious answers to the question, it's going to be something they can use to accuse him and diminish his popularity and his credibility with the public. Or when we get into the next section, you see that they're actually trying to specifically pit him against Rome, so the Romans will come in and take care of it at one point. So they start questioning and giving these questions, these testing questions during this period. And one of them is specifically about marriage and what Moses commanded. He refers to Moses' command in the Old Testament that if a man is going to divorce his wife, he must give her a written divorce. And to be clear, this was to protect women at the time, because the alternative would be that the man would just shut her out and say, bye, for whatever reason he was going to divorce her. Women had no right to divorce. They couldn't divorce their husbands, but husbands could just kick their wife out. And they could refuse to divorce them, which would leave them, unable to marry again, so unable to find support in the community. Or they could divorce them and leave them destitute and have no obligation to them, and they just basically would be cut off and set loose. But God gave Moses a command to command the men to give the wife a writ of divorce so that she could prove that her husband had put her away, had put her aside, and so she could remarry, or she could go back home and live with her family and not be perceived as having done something wrong. So it was a way of protecting women, but people used it very freely by the time of Jesus. And the specific question that they asked him is it right for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And Jesus says, no, it's not right to just divorce your wife for any and every reason. And at the time, there are some examples of men divorcing their wives because they burnt supper and they were mad at her, and so they would divorce her, give her a writ of divorce. There were even some instances of men trying to abuse this writ of divorce thing, and they would give their wife a writ of divorce and go and marry and sleep with another woman, divorce her, and then come back and remarry their first wife. It was all in the course of an afternoon. It was just basically trying to get around them so they could go to sleep with somebody else, commit adultery, and not be technically wrong, not be technically while they were married. And so they would do all that, and it was, people were just trying to abuse the system. And so Jesus says, no, that is not right. And then they come back and say, but Moses said, give them a writ of divorce. And Jesus said, Moses told you you could give a writ of divorce because of your hard hearts. But that's not the way that God designed marriage in the beginning. From the beginning, it was a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Therefore, what God's put together, let no one take apart. And so it's that's his response to their testing him. Moses said we could divorce. Who are you to say that we can't? That is not what God said from the beginning. What God said from the beginning was the two will become one flesh, and what God's put together, you should not take apart. So no, you cannot divorce your wife because she spilled the boiled pot, or burnt your supper, or because the lady next door looks cute and you'd like to go have a fling with her this afternoon. No, you cannot just divorce for any other reason. And so it's also during this period that Jesus starts those predictions of his death, right before the Transfiguration, and then 2 more times after the Transfiguration before he arrives in Jerusalem. And so he starts predicting his death and says specifically that it will be the religious leaders that reject him and hand him over to be killed. And then on the 3rd day he'll rise again. And so as his popularity rises, they feel more threatened, and they start doing more and more to try to discredit him, try to find reasons to tear him down, because as his popularity grows, as he grows a greater and greater following, their positions feel more and more tenuous, they feel more and more threatened. And then everything kind of comes to a head during Holy Week, and this is part of the goal of today was to get through Holy Week, so here we are finally, to talk about the conflict and get to the Holy Week. And the conflict with the religious leaders really climaxes during Holy Week. And it starts with the very first thing in Holy Week, which is what most Christians call the triumphal entry. And this, as Jesus is coming into the city, he's approaching the city, and he's coming through Bethphage and Bethany, those 2 towns that I told you about way back when we were talking about the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and I showed you the map and all that. There's those 2 villages that are near Bethlehem. And as he's coming through these villages, he sends his disciples ahead to go, and he says, go ahead into the town ahead, go into the village ahead of us, and you'll find there a colt tied up, a donkey tied up with a colt, and bring the colt to me. And one of the Gospels has them bring both the mama and the baby, bring the baby, the colt, and the mother donkey. And he says, go and bring them to me, and if anyone asks what you're doing, just tell them the Lord needs it. And understand at this time that a donkey was not an inexpensive thing. It was more like a vehicle. It was your means of transporting stuff, and sometimes yourself. And so it'd be like your pickup truck. And so imagine the situation, if it's your house, and these 2 scruffy-looking former commercial fishermen come rolling up into your yard, and they jump into your pickup truck and start starting it up, and look like they're going to drive off in it, and you would come running out and shout, "Hey, what are you doing? It's my truck!" and they say, oh, it's okay, the Lord leads it, and then drive off. Probably not going to get a calm response from me. I'm probably going to be calling the police and, chasing you down the street, something. But whatever the situation is, whether it's because they had heard of Jesus and they wanted to support his claim to be Messiah, whatever it was, they let the disciples go with the donkeys. And they bring the donkeys to Jesus, especially the young one, the colts, that had never been ridden by a person before. Anybody ever tried to ride a horse that has not been properly broken and trained?
I've seen people.
I would tell you to give it a shot, but then I might be suable, because you're probably going to get thrown and it's going to hurt a lot. Because they don't just like let people sit on them for the first time. But somehow this cult does, and they take their cloaks, the disciples, some of them take their outer garment and throw it over the back of the colt, and Jesus sits on it, and he rides into the city. And the streets on the way in are lined with people that are shouting and praising God, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And they're waving palm branches, which is why if you go to church service on the week before Easter, you will often, as part of the service, have kids or others waving branches of palm trees around, or throwing them on the floor in front of the processional, remembering this moment when Jesus comes into the city. And they're waving palm branches and they're tossing their cloaks and the branches and trees in the road in front of him, so that when he rides through on the donkey, he doesn't actually touch the dust of the road, doesn't touch the dirt of the road. And this is all very reminiscent of a triumph, of a Roman triumph, which is a tradition that got started way back in Rome's past when a king or a general came back triumphant after victoriously leading an army against whatever the threat was. When they came back into town, the town would line the streets, Rome would line its streets, and they would ride in, and it would be at the head of a great procession. They would have this grand speed and this great big parade, and everybody would praise the general for his victory, or praise the king for the great victory. And this usually, what Jesus is doing, the riding into the city, had a lot of similarities with the Roman triumph, but then it also has a lot of things that are very different in a way that makes fun of the Roman triumph. So, like, for example, if you were this great king riding back into Rome after a victorious campaign, military campaign, capturing lots of territory, you might come riding in on the best, most incredible looking horse you can find. Or you might come in with riding a chariot that is being drawn by several fine horses. And there was even at least one that involved elephants pulling a chariot. And several that involved having slaves pull a chariot that were taken in battle. So you take the warriors that you had just conquered and make them pull your chariot into town. Or even your king, if you were the defeated country. Your king might be pulling the chariot to pull the victorious general into town. And so it was a way of showing how powerful and how strong we are. And Jesus, when he comes riding into the city, he's not being led by a grand procession or slaves going before him. He's got his 12 disciples that are walking with him. And he's definitely not riding a fine steed. He's riding a colt of a donkey. Now, have you ever seen somebody riding a donkey? Donkeys aren't extraordinarily tall to start with. Mules are pretty tall. Mules are like half donkey, half horse, right? And so mules are fairly tall. They're much closer to horse height, but donkeys are shorter.
Aren't they weaker than horses?
Yeah, they're not strong, and they are temperamental. They can be very stubborn. There's several things about donkeys. They can be very loyal too. It's like donkeys can be great animals, but they can also be very stubborn if you make them mad. They tend to hold grudges pretty well. But they're shorter. And this was a colt, so it was a very young donkey. So it was even shorter. And so when Jesus sat down on this donkey, his head may have actually gone down. And so he's shorter than the crowd around him, riding a donkey that has been covered by some of his disciples' garments instead of some grand steed with a great saddle. And he's coming riding into the city, and it's a mockery of triumph. But it's also fulfilling Old Testament scripture from Zechariah that said that the king, when he came, behold, Jerusalem, behold your king coming, humble and meek is he, riding on a donkey on the foal, or the colt of a donkey, riding on this young donkey. And so there was a prophecy all the way back with Zechariah that the king, the Messiah, when he came, would ride a donkey into the city. And so everybody kind of recognizes this. Everybody recognizes this moment, and yet it's also kind of making fun of Rome. This is the triumphal entry is kind of the first time that it's unmistakable that Jesus is accepting the title or the role of Messiah in this very public, very recognizable way. He is riding into Jerusalem specifically in the way that the Messiah is prophesied to ride in, and the crowd gets it, and they're shouting out, "Hosanna to the Son of David," the title of the Messiah. And so, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And the Pharisees and the religious leaders see this, and they immediately start telling Jesus to calm his disciples down and disperse the crowd, because it's not right to be doing this. You can't be doing this. You can't be having this great scene. What if the Romans see it and think it's a rebellion? And Jesus responds to them and says, basically, it's right for them to do this, and if they did not, if the people were not crying out, if the people were not praising, then those stones themselves would cry out. So Jesus comes into the city, and the religious leaders don't like what he's doing. And then on his way in, he comes into the city, and he goes in. Actually, this is Sunday. He comes into the city, and he goes in, and he goes to the temple. And Mark says that he looks around and sees everything that's going on in the temple, and then he goes back out and spends the evening on the Mount of Olives, which is a mountain just outside the city. And then the next day, he comes back in, and on the way into the city, there is a fig tree. And Jesus sees this fig tree, and he's hungry. So he goes over to the fig tree, and it's in full leaf. There's leaves everywhere, but then when he looks inside, looks under the leaves, there's no fruit. There are no figs on the fig tree. But the text says that it's not the season for figs. It's leafed out, but it's not the season for figs yet. And yet, the tree has no figs on it, and Jesus curses it and says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And then he and his disciples go on into the city. And they go into the temple, and I had kind of given you all a diagram at one point of what was going on in the temple. And I gave you kind of the basics, that you had a temple, or the tabernacle, and inside of the temple or tabernacle area there was a building, and there was the Holy of Holies, and then there was the holy place, and this was the innermost part of the temple. And then outside of that we had a courtyard that had a bronze basin for cleansing, and then all the altars for making sacrifices. And that was the tabernacle setup. Well, in Jerusalem, this has been when the temple was built, this is complicated a little bit. And by the time we get to the Herod's temple, the first temple is Solomon's temple. The second temple was built under Ezra and Nehemiah, and then it is renovated under Herod. And so this is kind of the third iteration of the temple. So things have gotten a little bit more complicated. And now there is a kind of a second courtyard out in front that is this courtyard is only for men. It's the court of Israel. Only Jewish men can come in here to offer sacrifices. And then this area is called the court of women, and Jewish women can come in here and are they're permitted to come in to that area. And then there is this kind of larger outer courtyard that surrounds the whole thing, and it's much larger towards one side. And this is called the court of the Gentiles, because this is the only area that Gentiles can come into, that people that are not born of Israel can come into. And what Jesus had seen when he went into the temple that day, and when he'd gone in on the Sunday and seen what was in the temple, what he had seen was that they had begun to set up, well, not really begun, this has been going on for a long time, but they had set up a marketplace in the court of the Gentiles. And originally this marketplace was it was a very small thing, and it had a good purpose. If you were a first century Palestinian, first century Jewish man coming in to make a sacrifice on behalf of your family, and you had traveled miles and miles and miles, it's taken you a couple of days to get to Jerusalem, and you were bringing a lamb from among your flock in order to make a sacrifice at the temple, and you get there, and it turns out that you missed something about this lamb that makes it imperfect. Something that it has a blemish that you didn't notice, and now you can't offer it. What do? Well, your options are either to go all the way back to your home and look at your flock again and see if you can find another lamb that's worthy for sacrifice. It's been several days on that journey there and back, and hope that what you bring back you didn't make another mistake with, or to try to swap that animal or exchange that animal out with somebody in the area to be able to bring an unblemished sacrifice. Well, they started setting up booths in this outer courtyard for this purpose, to exchange animals. And so they would go and find animals that were unblemished, that were good to be sacrificed, but that the family didn't need to make sacrifice with, and they would buy them. And then they would go and take it to the temple, and there in the temple, they would take that, and if you brought in a blemished animal, you could exchange it for the unblemished animal for a fee. And so you would pay something and exchange your animal, and they would go and sell your animal somewhere else to make the rest of the money. And so it was a way of exchanging and making sure that you didn't have to travel all the way back home, or you didn't have to go and find somebody in the countryside to exchange your animal for you. So it was a good service. And then there was also another service that was necessary because Rome didn't have extremely standardized coins. There was a requirement, some of these sacrifices, some of the offerings that were demanded in the temple that were part of Jewish law, required that they have a certain amount of silver, that you give a certain amount of silver as the offering. And so it was like you had to give a shekel or 2 shekels or half a shekel. And so the shekel was a weight, it was an amount of silver that you had to offer. But all of the different coins in the Roman Empire from all the different regions had slightly different weights. And so you couldn't automatically assume that your silver coin was enough or that it wasn't too much. And so they started having people sit in the court of the Gentiles, and they would weigh your coins and give you a standard temple shekel so that the priests inside would know that you were giving the correct amount and that everything was kosher, everything was fine. And so that was something they did. Those two things were going on in this court of the Gentiles. And they were good services, things that helped people that were coming from various places in the empire come and make their offerings to God. But then over time, they started becoming more of a money-making scheme than a service to worshipers. And they started, by the time Jesus came along, there was such widespread abuse of this that people just kind of knew they were being fleeced when they got there. But you had to go and exchange your money for the standard temple shekel, or you couldn't make the offering. And so the money changers would use dishonest scales and use scales that were weighted so that the temple shekel seemed to weigh more and your coins seemed to weigh less. You needed more of your coins to equal a temple shekel. And so they would take the extra and they would make a lot of money for that. And then with the animals, they would take your animal, that you come in and have your animal checked, and a priest would look at it and say, that animal's blemished, you can't offer it, go to the stalls and exchange it. And if you go to the stalls and they would bring out another animal and they would say, okay, here, and you would pay a chunk, quite a bit of money to exchange your animal. And then they would go and take that same animal that you just brought in, that they said was blemished, take it around behind the curtain, fluff it up a little bit, make it look a little better, and then bring it out for the next person as the unblemished animal they were gonna buy, they were gonna exchange for. And so they were just swapping out the animals and basically taking a cut and making this huge amount of money off of it. And the reason that the priest would call it blemished in the first place is because the priesthood was getting a cut of all the business that happened in the court. And so this court of Gentiles would turn it on a market to do these things, and then other people just started selling things there. And again, because the priesthood got a cut of the pay, a cut of the exchange, and whatever was sold in the market, they allowed it and even encouraged it. And the end result was that this court of the Gentiles, again, the only place that a non-Jewish person can come in order to worship God, this is as close as they can get to the temple. This place is a noisy marketplace without enough room for anybody to kneel down in prayer. And so Jesus comes in and John has him wrap up a bunch of reeds together into kind of a whip or just a bundle of reeds to frighten people with. And he goes in and starts waving that bundle of reeds around and running the animals out, flipping over the money changers' tables with all the coins on it, and he drives everyone out of the temple courts. He runs everyone out of the court of the Gentiles. And as he's doing this, he is shouting, "It is written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." And so he's shouting them down because they have turned the court of the Gentiles, the only place that a non-Jewish person can go to access God. And they have turned it into a place where they, instead of prayer, it's for them to make money dishonestly. They are stealing from people dishonestly. And the priesthood is okay with it because they're making money off of it. And so Jesus clears out the temple. And then he stays and he answers questions and deals with things, including a question about his authority. Whose authority do you do this? What right do you have to drive out people from the temple? And Jesus asks them a question in return that they don't want to answer. And so he says, well, I'm not going to tell you where my authority comes from. And then, so Jesus' authority is questioned, and he answers it. But then he and his disciples that evening go back out, and the disciples see the fig tree that Jesus cursed that morning has withered up and died. It was nice and green that morning, and now it's withered up and dead. The disciples looking at it saying, "Look, Jesus, the tree you cursed." He said, "Yeah, you heard me curse it. What did you think was going to happen?" And then he promises and tells them that if you pray, similar things can happen to you. If you pray in faith, if you trust and you pray, you can move mountains. But make sure that you forgive those that you have something against, or your Father will forgive you. And the kind of question that follows up from this is, why did Jesus curse this fig tree? I mean, does it bother anybody that this is like the only destructive miracle of Jesus, the only time that he destroys or kills something by his power? And he curses a fig tree that was not in season because it did not have figs.
I'm guessing he was out to send a message from God?
Exactly. He is cursing the fig tree as a kind of embodied parable.
Oh.
He's saying this fig tree is like Israel. That's why he does it on the way in to clear out the temple. The fig tree is nice and green. It's got plenty of leaves, but when you go close to it and look, there's no fruit. There's nothing to eat. There's nothing that sustains. There's useful to you. So it looks good, but it has nothing useful in it. And so he said he's saying basically by cursing this is Israel. This is the temple. This is the religious leadership, the religious system of Israel right now. It's very pretty when you look at it from a distance. It's very pretty from the outside, but there's nothing in it that'll keep you alive. There's no sustenance in it. There's no life in it. So he curses the fig tree and says, "May no one ever eat from you again." And so after he clears out the temple and has his confrontation with the religious leaders, he goes out and his disciples find the tree is dead. And so the dead fig tree, the tree that was nice and green but had no fruit on it, and is now dead, is a parable for Israel. It's a parable for the religious system in Israel. It looks good from the outside, but it has nothing to sustain you, and its end result is going to be death. It's going to die. And so Jesus goes out. This is on Monday. This all happens on Monday. And then on Tuesday, Jesus comes back into town. After going back out in the evening, Jesus comes back into town and he starts telling those parables that we were talking about the other day. The parable of the wicked tenants and the wedding feast that were accusations. They were specifically meant to be against the religious leadership. There's also another, that's the parable of the two sons. It's a much shorter, simpler one. You can see reading that section. But it's these three he gives in that section where he's specifically responding to and accusing the religious leaders. And then the religious leaders come in with a series of 3 questions intended to trap Jesus. We have the first is whether to pay taxes to Caesar. The second is about marriage at the resurrection. And the third is what is the greatest commandment? And it's different groups each time bringing these questions, and who brings the questions is very interesting in some point. So the first commandment, or the first question, should we pay taxes to Caesar, is meant to be a trap. And the Herodians, who are the very pro-Roman, pro-Herod group of Jewish people, and the Pharisees bring it together, which is a really weird pairing in itself. Because these two groups do not like each other. Very, very pro-Rome and very much want to see Rome cast out, want to see Rome thrown out. A lot of their emphasis, the Pharisees' emphasis on keeping pure is so that the Messiah will come back and drive Rome away. And so, very pro-Rome, very anti-Rome. And yet they come together to try to discredit Jesus, and they ask this question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar? And the trap is that if he says, no, you should not pay taxes to Caesar, that's what people are expecting. That's what the people want Jesus to say. He is the Messiah. He is coming to drive Rome out and give them their country back. That's what they expect from the Messiah. That's what they want him to say. No, don't pay taxes to Caesar. But if he says that, then the Romans are going to hear, especially because the Herodians are there, the ones that are pro-Rome. The Romans are going to hear, and they're going to come down on Jesus. But if he says yes, well, the reason that you would pay taxes as Israel, the reason that Israel would pay taxes to Rome, is because they were a subordinate kingdom. They were a conquered people, and they were recognizing their subordinate position. They were paying tribute to a greater power. And so if Jesus, as the Messiah, says, yes, pay taxes to Rome, he's going to be, before he is even crowned, before anything else happens, he's going to be bending the knee to Caesar. And that's going to tick all the people off, especially the people that want to be free from Rome. And so they think, no matter what Jesus says, whether he says yes or no, he's going to have somebody mad at it. He's either going to have the Romans coming in after it, or he's going to have the people coming in after it.
He doesn't say either of those things, right?
Well, he does, but he doesn't say it the way they expected it.
Yeah, that's
Instead, he says, show me the coin that you used to pay your taxes.
he does.
And so they pull out a Roman denarius, a golden coin, and they look at it, and he looks at them and says, whose picture is this? Whose face is engraved on the coin, and whose inscription is around it? And they say, it's Caesar's, obviously. And so he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. And so he's basically saying, yes, you can pay your taxes to Caesar. Go ahead, pay your taxes to Caesar. He minted the money. If he loves it so much, give it back to him. It's fine. Give him that. But you belong to God. Your allegiance belongs to God, so you worship God. Fine, give him his coins. Pay taxes to Caesar, but pay your allegiance to God. Which satisfies both, because the Romans want the taxes. The Romans just want the money. But the people want to have their primary allegiance to God. They don't want the Messiah bending the knee to Rome before they even get started. And so that's, he avoids the big trap with taxes to Caesar, and then it looks like we'll have to finish this up next week.
He kills two birds with one stone.
Yeah. He also, another thing is that when he answers these questions, they are all obviously meant as traps. But the way that he answers them not only escapes the trap, but it teaches us something else too. Because this answer actually teaches us quite a bit about how to relate to government as Christians. Like, be a good citizen, pay your taxes, drive the speed limit where you can, do what you're supposed to do as a citizen, but if there's conflict between what God demands and what the government demands, your allegiance is to God, not to the government. So,
That's a different story.